Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie and today we'll be talking about the secret to flavoring alcohol. Today we'll be talking about esters, and what this is actually, it's a mixture between the organic acids from the yeast and alcohol. So when those two are mixed together, you have fruit-like flavors, fruity aromas inside your beer or wine. So this happens during fermentation, and it's a pleasant plus to have in your home brewing or your winemaking process. So I've made my friends try my batches, and they've always asked me, did you put a little apple in it or honey? And every time I'm like, no. Now I understand that it's actually the esters. So there are many esters that can be produced. There are roughly 100 esters that exist, and this can range from different types of fruits to different types of sweet and pleasant flavors and aromas. We also have floral esters, for example. And these esters are like chemical soldiers. Now we're gonna determine how to favor these esters into your homebrew, because esters are a good thing. You want that flavor, you want that aroma, the natural aroma, not necessarily with extracts, but natural aroma made from your home brewing process. The first component that influences esters is that the more sugar you use, the more esters are produced. However, if there's a lot of oxygen inside your wash, this will decrease the ester production. And usually when we make alcohol, you have to close the lid, therefore not much oxygen enters the jar. However, have you ever tried leaving your fermenting jar open or accidentally done so? It will give you vinegar instead of alcohol if you leave it out for too long. And vinegar accepts a lot of oxygen in that fermentation process, and there is no aroma, there is no flavor. And in my opinion, this is because there is more oxygen present. So drop a comment below and let me know, are any of you vinegar makers, and have you ever had flavors in your homemade vinegar? And we are talking about regular vinegar, not apple cider. For a recap, the first component for ester production is more sugar. Second is to have less oxygen. And the third is stronger alcohol lead to stronger levels of ester. And this makes sense because stronger alcohol means more sugar, which is the first component. They go hand in hand because the more sugar you have, the more food is available for the yeast to eat, and more alcohol will be produced. And you can determine this with the hydrometer. Once you put your hydrometer to measure your liquid at the beginning of the fermentation, it's going to give you a sort of estimate of how much alcohol you're supposed to achieve at the end. And this level of alcohol depends on the amount of sugar that you add. The fourth component of ester production is the type of your fermenting jar. So if you have a long, skinny, and tall jar, it's not favorable to ester production, and this is because there's too much pressure. So when you have a fermenting jar, the yeast at the bottom eating the sugar will produce CO2, and the CO2 floats to the top of the jar, and it's too much pressure because it's in a small circumference, and the pressure of the CO2 going to the top of the airlock is stronger. However, when you have a wide and shallow fermenting jar, the CO2 won't be as strong in one specific area. However, it'll be dispersed on the opening of the fermenting jar. And when you are completing fermentation, you absolutely need an airlock or anything that substitutes an airlock, meaning anything that leaves a little bit of air for the CO2 to go out to not have explosions in your house. And for the fermenting jars that I use, let me just show you an example. This is the fermenting jar type that I use. It's 1 gallon or 5 liters, and the link is in the description below if you'd like to purchase one. Got this from Amazon with an airlock, and you see that once the CO2 has accumulated inside the jar, it's gonna pop up in the airlock. Another factor that increases ester levels is stirring your liquid in your fermenting jar. And just an FYI, if you're wondering if you have to stir your homebrew every day, you do not. Personally, what I do, I stir it the first day once I put in the yeast just to invigorate it. And I only stir it when it's going too slow for my liking. So if the fermentation is not going well, and how do I know this? It's when the airlock is not bubbling. Therefore, if the airlock is bubbling, the fermentation is going well, I do not need to stir your alcohol. You can always do so, however, it's not mandatory. We also have your environment, therefore the temperature that you leave your jar in, and this goes in terms of the degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit where your jar stays. And if there's sunlight sometimes that reaches the jar, it's going to increase the temperature of your wash. The temperature does affect esters as well, because we mentioned that small narrow jars produce less esters because the CO2 pressure is too strong, and so does temperature. So once your temperature is low, the yeast is dormant, it eats less sugar, and there's going to be less CO2 and alcohol being produced. However, if it's in a warm environment and the yeast is eating the sugar, a lot of CO2 is being produced, and therefore the pressure tends to be higher, and watch out to the esters. Let's put this out there. If you want to sell your alcohol, if you want to make the same batch every time, be consistent with it, you have to control your environment, because the esters are the X factor. So they are produced based on the yeast interacting with the alcohol. However, there are many factors. It could be influenced by your temperature. So let's say you make a batch in the summer versus the winter, or let's say you stirred your jar twice for one batch and you stirred your jar 5 times for the other batch. It might have different types of esters produced. Therefore, you want to make sure that exactly the same environment and the same treatment is made for all your batches. And I'll give you a little bonus for ester production. What influences it is your oak barrels during the aging process. When it comes to younger wine, you typically have a sort of fruity flavor and aroma. However, if you'd like to age it in barrels, this is very hard to reach, by the way. But if you play your cards right and you're able to age your wine in the right type of barrel, you can have these sort of earthy, tobacco, smoky flavors and aromas. And this is a very sought after stage because it's not easy to reach this point in your winemaking process. And if you'd like to make wine, beer, cider, book a class. The link is in the description below. We have multiple tips and tricks, ingredients to use to help you out in your alcohol making journey. And if you found this video valuable, share with a friend. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.